People warned me before I left. Friends, family, even strangers on forums. They said Vietnam would be chaotic, exhausting, loud, impossible to navigate. They said the people would be cold to foreigners, that it would be transactional, that I'd always be the outsider looking in. They handed me this picture of a country that was essentially just a backdrop. Beautiful, sure, but ultimately indifferent to whoever passed through it. And for the first few months, honestly, part of me started to believe them. Because Vietnam will humble you fast if you walk in with assumptions. But here I am, 3 years later, sitting in my apartment in Tay Ho with a coffee that costs 40 cents and a life that looks nothing like what anyone predicted. And I have proof, real, lived, daily proof, that almost everything the world thinks it knows about Vietnamese people is wrong. Not a little wrong, fundamentally wrong. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. My name is Marcus Ellery. I'm 54 years old, originally from Bristol in the UK, and I moved to Hanoi in 2021. Not to teach English, not on some gap year adventure, not because I was running from something. I moved here because after 28 years working in logistics management, I looked up one day and realised the life I was living fit me about as well as a suit bought off the wrong rack. I wasn't unhappy exactly, but I wasn't alive either. I'd been to Southeast Asia a handful of times on business trips, and there was always this feeling, this pull toward Vietnam specifically. Something about the energy, the texture of it, the way the streets feel inhabited rather than just occupied. So I made the decision. I packed up the flat in Bristol, settled a few loose ends, and I got on a plane. And I want to tell you what I actually found, because it is so far removed from the travel guide version, the Reddit forum version, the I spent 2 weeks in Hoi An and I'm basically an expert version, that sometimes I have to laugh. Let me start from the beginning, because the very first misunderstanding hit me before I'd even been in the country 72 hours. I landed at Noi Bai International in Hanoi on a Tuesday evening in late August. The heat came at me like a wall when I walked out of the terminal. Humid, dense, almost physical. I had a local SIM card sorted before I left. I'd done that much research at least, and I'd booked a small guest house in the old quarter for the first 2 weeks while I figured out where I actually wanted to live long term. The taxi ride from the airport into the city is about 45 minutes, and I remember sitting in the back watching the city reveal itself gradually. Street stalls lit by bare bulbs, scooters weaving everywhere. People sitting on tiny plastic stools eating from bowls balanced on their knees. I had this feeling of being both completely foreign and oddly at home. The next morning I went out to find breakfast. There's a woman, I never actually learned her full name. Everyone in my neighbourhood called her Ba Lan, which is just a respectful way of saying Auntie Lan, who had a little fur stall on the corner of Hang Jie and one of the side streets. She was there at 6 in the morning, had been there since probably 4, with this enormous pot of broth that smelled like it had been simmering since the previous century. I walked up, pointed at the bowls, held up one finger, smiled. Classic tourist communication. She looked at me, looked back at her pot, said something to herself in Vietnamese that I absolutely did not understand, and handed me a bowl. I sat down on one of those low plastic stools. You know the ones, they're everywhere in Vietnam. And as a man of average build but decidedly Western proportions, they offer an experience that is humbling in its own quiet way. I ate the pho. It was extraordinary. I put the bowl back on her little folding table, said "Come on, thank you," the one phrase I'd actually practiced, and she looked at me, and then she laughed. Not meanly, just genuinely, warmly, like I'd said something delightfully unexpected. She said something else in Vietnamese, adjusted the way I'd placed the bowl, and gestured for me to sit back down. Then she brought me a small plate of fresh herbs and a cup of tea I hadn't ordered and didn't pay for. That right there, that small, unrequested act of practical generosity, was the first data point in what would become 3 years of completely overturning everything I thought I understood about this country and its people. Because here's the thing people get wrong most consistently about Vietnamese culture, and I've thought about this a lot. The world tends to interpret Vietnamese people through a Western lens of social warmth. We're used to people smiling broadly at strangers, making small talk, expressing enthusiasm openly. And when Vietnamese people don't perform warmth in that specific, recognisable way, Westerners often conclude that they're cold, reserved, unwelcoming, that the relationship is purely transactional. I have heard this from so many expats, people who've lived here for months, sometimes years, and it drives me a bit mad, because what they're mistaking for coldness is actually something entirely different. It's a different grammar of care. Vietnamese warmth is not performed. It's not announced. It doesn't come with a big smile and an enthusiastic "welcome." It comes in the form of Ba Lan bringing you tea you didn't ask for. It comes in the form of your neighbour noticing you look unwell and appearing at your door with a bottle of rehydration salts and a look that says, "obviously." It comes in the form of the landlord's wife sending food down with her daughter because she heard you were working late and assumed you hadn't eaten. These are not grand gestures. They are quiet, practical, deeply embedded habits of looking after the people in your orbit. And if you're not watching for them, you will miss them completely and conclude that nobody cares about you. I moved to the Tai Ho district, Westlake, after about 6 weeks in the Old Quarter. The Old Quarter is extraordinary, but it is also relentless. It's the kind of beautiful that requires you to be on all the time. Tai Ho is different. It's where a lot of expats end up, yes, but it's also just a neighbourhood, a real one. There are local families who have lived in the same houses there for 3 generations. There are morning markets along the Lake Road. There are temples that get genuinely busy on the 1st and 15th of the lunar month. Not because tourists come to them, but because people actually go to pray. My apartment is on the 4th floor of a narrow building on a lane off Xuan Deo. I pay around 9 million Vietnamese dong a month, that's roughly $360, for 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen and a balcony that looks out over the rooftops toward the lake. When I tell people that back in Bristol, there is a pause and then they say something like, "But what's the catch?" There isn't one. That's just what it costs. The building is owned by a family. The father, whose name is Min, is in his late 60s. His wife handles most of the practical building matters. They live on the ground floor. Their son and daughter-in-law are on the 2nd, and I am on the 4th. When I moved in, I expected the relationship to be professional. Landlord and tenant. Money exchanges hands. Maintenance gets done. That's it. That is not what happened. Within the first month, Min had invited me to sit with him in the evenings when he takes his tea on the front step. His English is limited. My Vietnamese was at that point almost non-existent, and we communicated through a combination of gestures, phone translation apps, and the kind of patient willingness to just sit together in silence that I don't think I'd ever really experienced before. There's a Vietnamese concept. I'm not going to pretend I have a deep scholarly understanding of it, but there's this sense that being present with someone, physically occupying the same space and time, has its own meaning independent of conversation, that you don't need to fill every moment with words to be companionable. Coming from a culture where silence between 2 people who are supposed to be socialising is considered awkward, this took some adjustment. But once I adjusted, I found I loved it. By my 2nd month, Min's wife, everyone calls her Chi Hua, had started including me in Sunday lunches. Not every week, not formally, just sometimes. The door at the base of the stairs would be open and there would be the smell of cooking, and Chi Hua would call up the stairwell something that I eventually understood to mean approximately, "Come and eat, it's ready." These lunches were loud and busy, and I understood maybe 30% of what was being said, but nobody seemed to mind. The daughter-in-law, a young woman named Phuong, who had studied some English in university, would sometimes translate the broad strokes of the conversation. Mostly they just included me as if my incomprehension was a minor inconvenience rather than a barrier. This is the second great misunderstanding the world has about Vietnamese people. They are not, as I said, expressive in the Western sense, but they are also profoundly not exclusionary. The image of the tight-knit Vietnamese family as a closed unit, impenetrable to outsiders, is one I have heard repeated constantly, and my experience has been almost the exact opposite. What I found was that if you show up with genuine respect, if you make an effort, even a clumsy one, and if you're willing to participate rather than just observe, Vietnamese families open up in a way that is almost overwhelming. I remember the first Tet I spent in Hanoi. Tet is the Lunar New Year, and it's the most important holiday in the Vietnamese calendar by a significant margin. The city transforms, shops close, streets that are normally packed go quiet, flower markets open along the roadsides. There's this smell, I can't fully describe it, of chrysanthemums and incense and something sweet being fried. Chi Hua had told me, about 2 weeks before, that I should plan to be around. She didn't say why, she just said, "Don't go anywhere for Tet." So I didn't. On the eve of Tet, I was invited downstairs for the family meal. The table was covered in food I mostly didn't recognise. There were dishes I later learned were traditional, bang chung, which is this dense, square, sticky rice cake wrapped in banana leaves, a braised pork dish called tit ko, various pickled vegetables. There were extended family members I'd never met. There were children running around. There was rice wine being poured into very small glasses with a frequency that I underestimated badly in the early part of the evening. At some point, Min raised his glass to me specifically and said something. Fung translated. He said I was welcome in their home like a member of the family and that they hoped I would have good luck in the new year. I want to be clear that I am not someone who gets emotional easily. I am a 54-year-old man from Bristol who spent 3 decades in logistics. But sitting at that table, in that house, in that city, on the other side of the world from everything I'd known, I had to look at the ceiling for a moment and collect myself. That is Vietnam. That is what the world misses. And I've only just started. Because the cultural depth, the complexity, the contradictions, they go much further than warmth and hospitality. What I want to get into now is something that I think confuses and sometimes frustrates expats more than anything else. And it comes down to a concept that I've spent 3 years trying to understand properly. In Vietnam, there is a way of navigating social situations that prioritises harmony above almost everything else. It's not about dishonesty. I want to be careful here because I've heard expats dismiss it as just, they lie to be polite, and that's completely the wrong reading. It's more that directness, in the Western sense, is considered a kind of bluntness that can damage the social fabric. If someone asks you to do something and you can't do it, saying no flatly is not the default. The default is to find a way to manage the situation that doesn't put either party in an uncomfortable position. This sounds evasive. I understand why it sounds evasive. It drove me absolutely insane for the first 6 months. I'll give you a specific example. I was trying to get some work done on my apartment. I wanted to add a shelf unit to the bedroom wall. I asked the building's maintenance contact, a young guy named Tuan, who did odd jobs for various properties in the lane, if he could do it. He said yes. We agreed on a day. That day came and went. I asked again. He said yes, definitely, this week. That week came and went. This cycle repeated 4 times. By the end, I was genuinely confused and starting to feel like I was being strung along. Eventually, Phuong explained it to me. Tuan didn't have the right drill bit for the type of wall in the apartment. He could have said this immediately, but saying, "I can't do it," felt to him like a failure of face, a concept called mat in Vietnamese, both for himself and potentially for me. So instead, he kept agreeing and hoping the situation would resolve itself. Once I understood this, it completely changed how I asked questions and navigated practical matters. I stopped asking yes or no questions and started asking open-ended ones. Instead of, "Can you do this?" I learnt to ask, "What would you need to get this done?" And almost immediately conversations became more productive. Not because people changed, but because I did. This is the thing nobody tells you about living abroad. The adjustment is yours, not theirs. And I think that's where a lot of people who come to Vietnam, even people who stay for years, get stuck. They arrive with this unexamined assumption that the world will eventually conform to their expectations if they wait long enough. Vietnam will not do that. It will be polite about it, it will be warm about it, it will feed you and include you and make space for you, but it will remain entirely itself. And the people who come to love this country are the ones who eventually stop waiting for it to become familiar and start finding the beauty in the actual foreignness of it. I'm still finding it. Every single week. There's a morning walk I do around the lake, Ho Tay, West Lake, that takes about an hour and a half if I do the full loop. I started doing it in my second month here, and I've done it probably 400 times since. And it never looks exactly the same. At 6 in the morning, there are older women doing group aerobics to music that seems to have been selected by committee across multiple decades. There are men with fishing rods standing in absolute stillness for hours. There are teenagers who should probably be asleep. There are couples walking hand in hand in a way that feels, here, still slightly transgressive. Public affection was much more frowned upon a generation ago, and the younger Vietnamese are navigating that shift in real time. And every time I do that walk, someone nods at me. Someone says, "Anh ơi," a respectful address for an older man, and shows me something. A fish they've caught, a flower someone has left at one of the lakeside shrines, a particularly spectacular sunrise. Small exchanges, but they accumulate. They build into something that starts to feel very much like belonging. Which brings me to something I want to address directly, because I know it's a question that sits in the back of people's minds when they hear someone like me talk about feeling at home in a place like this. Can a foreigner really belong in Vietnam? Truly belong? Or is it always going to be a comfortable version of being an outsider? Honestly, I think it's somewhere in between, and I've made a kind of peace with that. I will never be Vietnamese. I will never have the shared history, the cultural reflexes, the understanding that comes from growing up inside this language and this way of life. There are moments, political conversations, certain family dynamics, the weight of historical memory that this country carries in its bones, where I feel the distance clearly, where I understand that I am a guest and that there are rooms I will never fully enter. But the question isn't whether you can become Vietnamese. The question is whether you can be genuinely welcomed into the life that exists here and participate in it with real meaning. And to that question, my 3 years here have given me a very clear answer. Yes, absolutely yes, but you have to earn it. And you earn it the same way you earn anything real, slowly, imperfectly, and with a willingness to be wrong. Let me tell you about the moment I actually understood, not intellectually, but in my gut, what this country was teaching me. It was about 14 months in. My Vietnamese had reached the point where I could handle basic transactions, understand about half of what Min said when he spoke slowly, and embarrass myself comprehensively in any situation requiring nuance. I'd built a small routine, the morning lake walk, coffee at a little place on Dang Tai Mai, run by a woman named Ko Nun, who made café trung, egg coffee, that I remain convinced is the greatest thing human beings have figured out how to do with caffeine. Work in the mornings, usually freelance consulting to cover my living costs. Lunch somewhere local. Afternoons that I spent however I felt, which was a luxury I still hadn't fully adjusted to after 30 years of structured employment. That afternoon I was sitting on a small bench near one of the little temples along the lake road. A boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, came and sat next to me completely uninvited. He looked at me for a long moment with the frank, assessing stare that Vietnamese children have, which is startlingly direct in a way that even many adults aren't. Then he said, in English that was careful and deliberate in the way of someone who has been practicing, "Where are you from?" I told him. "England." He thought about this. Then he said, "England is cold?" I said, "Yes, often." He thought about this some more. Then he said, "Why do you come here?" And I tried to explain. I said that I liked it here, that it was beautiful, that the food was wonderful. He seemed to find this acceptable, but not fully satisfying, the way children do when they can sense an adult hasn't quite given the real answer. He sat with me for another few minutes in companionable silence, then got up and ran off toward wherever he'd come from. But the question stayed with me. Why did I come here? And somewhere in the quiet of that afternoon by the lake, I found the honest answer, the one I hadn't quite articulated before. I came here because I was tired of living in a world that moved so fast it had stopped noticing things. And Vietnam, complicated, loud, sometimes maddening Vietnam, notices things. Ba Lan notices when you look tired and adjusts your order without being asked. Min notices when you haven't been out in a couple of days and finds a reason to knock on your door. The city itself seems to notice the time of day, the season, the light, and respond to it. There's a texture to daily life here that I hadn't felt in decades, maybe ever. And once you feel it, you understand why people stay. Not because Vietnam is perfect. It is emphatically not perfect. The traffic will test everything you think you know about physics and human psychology. The bureaucracy around visas and residency is its own ongoing adventure that I will get into. The air quality in Hanoi on certain winter days is something you feel in your chest. The noise, and I say this as someone who has genuinely come to love it, is constant and democratic and takes no prisoners. But the life that exists inside all of that, the actual human life, it is rich in a way that I don't think any amount of travel writing or YouTube content or second-hand stories can fully capture. You have to live it, day by day, bowl of fur by bowl of fur, awkward language attempt by awkward language attempt. And that's exactly what I want to walk you through. Because I haven't even gotten to the part that surprised me most. The parts that didn't just challenge my assumptions, but broke them entirely and rebuilt something better in their place. The Vietnamese relationship with time, with the past specifically, is something I need to explain to you, because I think it's the key to understanding everything else. And it starts with a conversation I had in a small city in the centre of the country, in a place I visited about 8 months into my time here, and that I still think about almost every day. I'd taken a train down to Da Nang for a week, partly to see a different part of the country, and partly just to shake up my routine. From Da Nang I took a day trip to Hoi An, which everyone does, and for good reason. It's genuinely beautiful. But I also went further, up into the hills toward a village that a local friend had mentioned, a place that doesn't appear in many tourist itineraries. And it was there, sitting in someone's home drinking tea I'd been offered within 30 seconds of arriving, that I had a conversation that I wasn't prepared for. The man's name was Ong Phuc. He was in his mid-70s. His English was halting but present, learned decades ago under circumstances he hinted at but didn't elaborate on. He knew I was British, and he asked me, with genuine curiosity and absolutely no hostility, what I had been taught about the war. I want to be honest with you about how I felt in that moment. I felt the specific discomfort of someone who knows that whatever they're about to say is going to be inadequate. Because what I'd been taught was the American version, filtered through British media, the war as American tragedy, American disillusionment, American loss, the Vietnamese as background, as landscape. I told him this because he deserved honesty. He nodded for a long time. Then he said something I've been turning over ever since. He said, "We don't talk about it as much as you expect. We talk about what came after." And I didn't fully understand what he meant until I'd spent another 2 years in this country and started to see it everywhere. In the way the economy has transformed in a single generation, in the ambition of young Vietnamese people, the energy, the hunger, the absolute refusal to be defined by the past. In the way the country holds its history with a kind of dignity that doesn't require performance of victimhood or grievance. What came after? That's what matters here. That's what drives the engine. This is perhaps the deepest misunderstanding the world has about Vietnam. We come here carrying the weight of history, colonialism, war, tragedy, and we expect to find a people shaped by bitterness or fragility. What we find instead is something that honestly shamed me into examining my own relationship with the past. Because this country has been through things that would define and diminish many nations, and instead it has chosen, consciously, culturally, generationally, to build, to move, to look forward with an appetite that is almost aggressive in its optimism. The average age in Vietnam is around 30. Think about what that means. More than half this country has no personal memory of the hardest decades. They are building something new on top of everything their parents and grandparents survived, and they are doing it with a velocity that is genuinely breathtaking to watch. I've watched businesses open in my neighbourhood in Tay Ho that would not look out of place in London or Amsterdam. Coffee shops with stunning design sensibility, restaurants that are doing something genuinely creative with Vietnamese ingredients, small tech companies run by people in their 20s who have more commercial instinct than anyone I managed in 30 years of corporate life. And all of it sits right next to the old. The barlands with their fur carts, the temple ceremonies, the lunar calendar, the old men playing chess under the banyan trees by the lake. That coexistence, old and new, traditional and modern, rooted and accelerating, is what makes Vietnam unlike anywhere else I've encountered. And it's what makes the people here so consistently surprising if you come in with an open mind and the patience to actually look. Now, I want to get specific about something because I think specificity is where these stories actually become useful rather than just atmospheric. One of the things people ask me most often when I talk about living here is whether the expat life is sustainable, whether the warmth and welcome you feel in those early stages actually lasts, whether you eventually hit a ceiling, some invisible boundary where the culture says, that's enough access, you can go no further. And I want to give you an honest answer because I think too many people in my position paint everything either too rosy or too cautious. The answer is, there is a ceiling, but it's higher than you think, and getting there takes time and requires things from you that not everyone is willing to give. About 18 months in, I started learning Vietnamese seriously. Not tourist Vietnamese, not survival Vietnamese. I hired a tutor, a young woman named Lien, who taught at a university nearby and took on private students for extra income. We met twice a week at a cafe on Quang An, and she was patient with me in the way that only truly skilled teachers are, which is to say, she let me fail repeatedly and specifically, then corrected me with precision rather than encouragement. Vietnamese is a tonal language, which means the same syllable said with 6 different tones means 6 completely different things. My British accent and my ear, trained for decades on the flat plains of English, found this genuinely challenging. I said things I did not intend to say on a regular basis, and the looks I received in response were educational in their variety. But something happened around the 5th month of lessons. I was in a market near my apartment buying some vegetables, the market on Tui Quay, which runs along the southern edge of the lake and which I'd been going to weekly since I arrived. The woman at one of the vegetable stalls, an older woman, probably in her late 60s, who had never given me more than a polite transactional nod, said something to me in Vietnamese that I actually understood. She was asking if I wanted the small ones or the large ones, referring to some variety of squash I was looking at. And I answered, in Vietnamese, correctly. She stopped, looked at me properly for what felt like the first time, and then she launched into a rapid-fire conversation that I definitely could not keep up with, but the direction of it was clear. She was delighted, not performing delight, actually delighted, and from that market visit onward, she always had something set aside for me when she saw me coming, not because I'd bought some special loyalty, but because I had, in her eyes, done her the respect of trying to meet her in her language. That is not a small thing here. It opens doors that stay firmly shut for people who never try. This is what I mean when I say you have to earn it. You don't earn it with money. You don't earn it with enthusiasm. You earn it with effort that costs you something. Time, pride, the willingness to be laughed at gently and correct your mistake and try again. Let me talk about the healthcare situation for a moment, because it's something I get asked about constantly, and there are a lot of myths floating around. I'm a 54-year-old man. I'm in reasonably good health, but I have the standard maintenance issues that come with that age. A knee that has opinions about cold weather, blood pressure that requires monitoring, the general accumulating administrative burden of a body that's been used for half a century. Before I moved, people told me the healthcare would be a disaster, that I'd be evacuated to Singapore for anything serious, that the hospitals were overcrowded and the standards were poor. My experience has been nothing like this. Hanoi has several international hospitals. I use one in the Tay Ho area, where the standard of care is genuinely impressive and the costs are a fraction of what they'd be in the UK private sector. I've also, on occasions when timing made it more practical, used local Vietnamese hospitals, and while the language barrier is real and needs managing, the medical competence has not been in question. A standard GP equivalent consultation runs me somewhere between 200 and 400,000 dong, call it $8 to $16. My annual comprehensive checkup last year cost me less than $150. I carry international health insurance anyway as a baseline, but it's never been a source of the anxiety people told me it would be. The cost of living more broadly, because I know this is the number everyone actually wants. My rent, as I said, is around $360 a month. Food is almost negligible if you eat as I do, which is mostly local. A meal at Barland's stall is less than $2. A sit-down lunch at one of the decent local restaurants nearby is between $3 and $6. Coffee ranges from 40 cents at a street stall to maybe $2 at the nicer places. I spend money on groceries, on the occasional Western-style meal when I want it, on transport. I have an electric scooter, which is the only sensible way to navigate the city, and on the general texture of a comfortable life. Total monthly outgoings come to around $1,000 to $1,200 US, including the health insurance. For that I live well. Not austerely, well. But I want to be careful here, because I've seen people move to Vietnam purely on the basis of the cost of living calculation and then be miserable. If you come here primarily as a financial strategy, as a way to make your money go further, Vietnam will accommodate that. But it won't fulfill you. The fulfillment, if it comes from the culture, from the people, from the willingness to actually engage with where you are, rather than treating it as a cheap backdrop for the same life you were living somewhere else. And this brings me back to the central thing I want to say about Vietnamese people, about what I've come to understand after 3 years that I couldn't have understood in 3 weeks or 3 months. Vietnamese people are not what the world thinks they are. They're not the simplified version, the gracious but distant hosts of a charming developing nation. They're not the war narrative's background characters. They're not the street food and scooter aesthetic that fills Instagram and travel blogs. They are a people with a specific, sophisticated, deeply rooted way of being in the world that rewards the effort to understand it with something I can only describe as genuine human connection. And human connection, real connection, not the performed kind, is something that I think many of us in the Western world have been quietly starving for without fully realising it. I know I was. The pace of life I was living in Bristol, the efficiency of it, the productivity of it, the relentless forward motion of it was producing outputs, but not meaning. Vietnam produces meaning, sometimes inefficiently, sometimes loudly, sometimes in ways that make no logistical sense, but it produces it. Here's something that happened about 6 months ago that I keep coming back to as a kind of summary of everything I've been trying to say. I'd had a genuinely bad week. Nothing dramatic, a business arrangement that fell through, a health issue that turned out to be minor but required several anxious days of waiting for test results, a spell of the kind of low-grade loneliness that catches you off guard when you're living abroad and you suddenly feel the distance from your old life more acutely. I'd spent most of that Friday working and not really talking to anyone, and by evening I was in one of those moods where everything feels a bit grey. I went down to the front step of the building. I sometimes sit there in the evenings, as Min does. He was there already. We sat in silence for a while, in that way we'd established over 2 years of sharing that step. He had a thermos of tea. He poured me some without being asked. After a bit, without looking at me, he said something in Vietnamese. Slowly, deliberately, in the way he does when he knows he wants me to understand. I caught most of it. He said something like, "You look like you have a heavy head today." I said yes. A little. He nodded. He didn't ask why. He didn't offer solutions or perspective or any of the things a Western friend might default to. He just poured more tea and stayed. And that was it. That was the whole thing. And it was enough. More than enough. It was the most perfectly calibrated act of human solidarity I think I've ever experienced. There's a word I've heard Vietnamese people use when they talk about relationships, tình cảm. It roughly translates to something like emotional bond or feeling of warmth, but neither of those quite gets there. It's more about the accumulated weight of shared time and care, the layering up of small moments into something that eventually holds weight. Min and I have tình cảm. It took nearly 2 years to build, and it's made of hundreds of small things. Shared cups of tea, phone translation attempts, me badly mispronouncing things while he tried not to laugh, him showing me what to do at the Tet altar when he sensed I wanted to participate but didn't know how. This is what the world doesn't understand about Vietnamese people. They are not slow to connect. They are precise about it. They are investing in something real, and they are patient enough to let it develop at the pace real things develop at. I've also come to understand the concept of te zien, a form of social face that is about collective dignity rather than just personal pride. The way this plays out in daily life is subtle, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. There is a genuine, deeply held concern in Vietnamese social interactions for maintaining everybody's dignity, not just your own. When something goes wrong in a transaction or an arrangement, the Vietnamese instinct is not to assign blame publicly, but to find a path that lets everyone involved save face. This infuriates some Western expats who want clear accountability and explicit acknowledgement of fault. But what it actually produces, when you understand it, is a social environment where conflict rarely escalates to destruction, where relationships are preserved even when situations go wrong. I've had disputes, minor ones, with neighbours, with contractors, with the occasional frustrating bureaucratic situation. Every single one has resolved through a process that felt, to my Western instincts, maddeningly indirect. And every single one has also resolved without destroying the relationship. I still wave to the contractor who strung me along about those shelves for 2 months. He still waves back. Because neither of us made the other person lose face in the resolution of it, and that means the social fabric between us is still intact. In England, I would have had a direct conversation that cleared the air, and then spent the next 3 years slightly uncomfortable around that person. This is better. It is genuinely better. And recognising that a different approach can produce better human outcomes than the approach you grew up with, is one of the most valuable things 3 years in Vietnam has given me. Now I need to talk about something that I think is important and that doesn't get discussed honestly in most expat content. Because I've painted a picture that is genuinely the picture I see, but I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't acknowledge the complexity, the things that are hard, the things I'm still working through. Vietnam is a country that changed very fast and is still changing. The generation that is now in its 20s and 30s grew up with access to global culture, social media, international education, travel that their parents didn't have. This has created some interesting friction within Vietnamese society itself, between traditional values and modern pressures, between the communal emphasis that runs deep in Vietnamese culture and the individualistic aspirations that globalization tends to produce. I see it in Phueng, the daughter-in-law from my building. She is brilliant, genuinely brilliant, with a commercial instinct and an ambition that is impressive to be around. She has ideas for a business she wants to start. She also has a set of family obligations and expectations around her time and her income that she navigates with enormous grace, but that I can see, sometimes, weigh on her. The expectation that she will contribute substantially to the family unit, that decisions will be made collectively, that her success belongs to the family rather than just to herself, these are not burdens in the Vietnamese view of them. They are the fabric. But for someone who has also absorbed a world of international influences, that fabric sometimes sits differently than it did for previous generations. This is not a problem unique to Vietnam. Every culture navigates the tension between tradition and change. But in Vietnam, the speed of change is so dramatic. The country in 2024 is unrecognisable compared to the country of 30 years ago in almost every material dimension, that this navigation is happening in real time, in every family, in every neighbourhood. And it is one of the most fascinating things to be a witness to. I've been to Ho Chi Minh City a handful of times. I want to say clearly that Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City are very different places, and the experience of living in one versus the other would be quite different. Ho Chi Minh City is faster, louder, more commercial, more visibly cosmopolitan. The energy is different, more kinetic, more transactional in some ways. Hanoi has a different quality, older, more bureaucratic in some ways, with a culture that feels slightly more rooted in traditional forms. Neither is better. They are different countries within the same country, in some meaningful sense. The North-South divide within Vietnam is real, and the Vietnamese themselves will tell you about it readily, often with humour. Hanoians are considered by Southern Vietnamese to be slower, more formal, more concerned with hierarchy. Southern Vietnamese are considered by Hanoians to be louder, more commercial, less cultured. Both characterizations are overblown, and both contain a grain of something. What I can say from my time in both cities is that the fundamental warmth, the ting cam, the practical generosity, the quiet care is present in both. It just expresses itself differently, like accents of the same language. Let me bring this back around to something personal, because I think the most honest thing I can tell you is not just what Vietnam is like, but what it's done to me. I came here at 51 thinking I was doing something brave and slightly eccentric. A man in his 50s uprooting his entire life and moving to Southeast Asia with a vague sense that something needed to change. I expected to find a nice place to live cheaply and maybe write the memoir I'd been threatening to write since my 40s. I did not expect to be substantially remade as a person, but that is what happened. Vietnam has a way of holding up a mirror, not unkindly. The directness is not there, as I said, it's done through the contrast. When you live inside a culture that values things differently from the culture you came from, you start to see your own culture's values with a clarity that's impossible from inside them. I started to see how much of my English identity was built on the performance of self-sufficiency, how much energy I'd spent my whole adult life making sure I never seemed to need anything from anyone, how deeply I'd absorbed the idea that depending on your community, really depending on it, openly and practically, was somehow embarrassing. In Vietnam, dependence is not embarrassing. Interdependence is the fundamental unit of life. You are not a self-contained individual navigating the world. You are a node in a web of relationships that has mutual obligations running in all directions, and those obligations are not a burden, they are the substance of a meaningful life. You take care of your neighbours, and your neighbours take care of you, and this is not charity, and it is not transaction. It is just how human beings are supposed to exist together. I know how this sounds. It sounds like someone who had a nice experience abroad and has slightly over-romanticised the local culture. I have heard this criticism and I take it seriously. Because it is possible to do that, to fall in love with a place and stop seeing it clearly. I have tried very hard not to do that. I have tried to hold both things at once, the genuine richness of what I've found here and the complexity that complicates it. But I also want to push back on the cynicism that treats any genuine enthusiasm about a foreign culture as naive. Because sometimes the thing you discovered really is as good as you think it is. Sometimes your experience really is data. Sometimes 3 years of daily life in a place gives you something worth saying. And what I want to say, having sat with this for 3 years and watched carefully and gotten things wrong and tried again and been fed and welcomed and corrected and included, what I want to say is this. Vietnam is one of the most misunderstood countries on earth. Not because it's hiding anything, but because understanding it requires a kind of patience that most of the ways we encounter places, tourism, media, other people's stories don't build. It requires you to slow down, to show up repeatedly, to accept that you will be confused and uncomfortable, and that this is not a problem to be solved, but a process to be lived. The Vietnamese people I have come to know are not the version the world carries around in its head. They are funnier, warmer, fiercer, more sophisticated, more internally complex, and more generous than almost anything I'd read or heard before I arrived. They have a relationship with time and community and meaning that I think the hyper-individualised Western world is quietly desperate for and doesn't know how to ask for. I'm not saying move to Vietnam. I'm not saying your life will look like mine, or that it should. What I'm saying is, examine the assumptions you carry about this place and these people. Ask where they came from, because I can tell you from 3 years of actual evidence, most of them are wrong. And in the space where the wrong assumptions used to be, there's room for something much more interesting. That's what I found anyway. Still finding. Every morning on the walk around the lake. Min was on the step when I came back from the walk this morning. He had already poured 2 cups. I don't think I need to say anything more than that.